Cool, perfection. Okay, we are live, buddy. Welcome to beautiful Sutton, Ontario,
Hey.
where we are hanging out. So thank you for doing this with me. Welcome to the Gabe and Nolan podcast part 2. 4 years on, or 3 years on, or whatever it is, since the pandemic and all that jazz. This is going to be a good time. We're going to talk about a whole bunch of stuff.
Yeah,
this
we
session,
got a lot.
This session right now, we're starting on the UK.
Yes.
We're talking about this book in particular, or maybe a tiny bit of it. This is a remarkably good book about the entire history of everything, or at least everything in England. It is the real sort of like touching point for me right now because I am trying to write some sort of text of my own on the UK, much less an entire history of the UK. I'm more something sort of reflecting on my own personal experiences and views and experiences with the country.
Yeah, and I guess a good question to start off with is why did you want to write a book on the UK?
Yeah, so I think I kind of just answered that in terms of the personal connection.
Right.
So that's a really big part of it. And then another aspect that I think is also really unique and important is just the UK is a really important country, and it's also really weird and isolated and special in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And I think understanding it, one of the things that I've been learning as I've been doing this research is that understanding it is not just important and helpful in terms of understanding the UK as a country. It's also important for understanding Europe, because Europe is this crazy mesh of weird different stuff and problems and mixes. And the UK has many of those same issues, but it's literally separated, and it's physically sort of a different part of the deal in a way. So that's some of the stuff that's been really interesting to me about the UK, and that's partly why I'm setting off on this journey, trying to write this little book.
Yeah.
So what I think is special, one of the many things that I think is special about this particular little text is its way of dealing with colonialism and colonial matters.
Right, yeah. And so it has a really interesting section, and I was wondering if you wanted to talk about it. Makes a colonial argument about the UK in particular. That's really cool.
Yeah. For sure. So you read that bit too, buddy. Do you want to give me some of your...
Yeah, it was this, and it's a book with delightful little diagrams explaining all of this, but the essential of the idea is that it's saying that UK's elite was much more open to kind of transmigration because it was based on a language and culture rather than the strict family lineages, and this allowed the UK essentially to be kind of sort of almost colonized by French-speaking elites, basically, right? And so the idea is that the UK gets taken over as a colony and then proceeds to export colonialism around the world, which is a really interesting sort of thesis.
Totally, and I think that critical moment that you're referring to, but historically, I think that critical moment is in many ways compounded in the invasion of William the Conqueror.
Yes.
And he's the reason, of course, that people make that a nice, obvious point for people to engage with is because he very overtly shows up and decimates the existing ruling elite and imports his own ruling elite to sort of replace it. But one of the things that's cool about British history, the more you learn about it, is that he does it in a very drastic and historically memorable way. The Battle of Hastings, you have all these stories.
1066 for people listening, right? And Battle of Hastings.
The Bayeux Tapestry, all this really remarkable, distinctive stuff. But sorry, where was I? What was my?
Oh, so you're talking about that he does it in a really historically unique way.
Exactly, but it's part of a very much a repeated pattern across British history, and it's something that once that initial removal by William the Conqueror occurs, you open up the floodgates really for successive generations of elite to use that as a model for replacing whatever existing elite is, or whatever existing dominant royal elite is around with the new existing dominant royal elite.
Right.
Which is funny. I mean, here, of course, one of the problems we're running into is subsections of the elite and what the elite actually are. But this is, of course, tied up with the whole colonial project in general.
Yeah.
Anything to say on that, buddy? What are you thinking?
Yeah, well, it was really interesting because that passage that we read from the book talks about how this elite is strong enough to kind of resist monarchical authority, and how this leads to the Magna Carta, which in 1215 at Runnymede,
Exactly.
which is a famous document asserting the rights of the nobles over essentially, and the church over essentially the rights of the king.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's that church bit that for me is also starting to become really interesting. Because the church is playing a number of really important narrative roles. And one of the things that I'm doing whenever I'm trying to read history is I'm trying to find normal people, like you and I or whoever, who are typically, especially in these early periods, they're actively excluded from history. There's the only purpose to sort of create monuments and to record information at all is to sort of create some sort of power complex for a future generation.
Right.
So you just don't have the sorts of piggybacking processes that we rely on today to get our little narratives out, right?
Right.
The only reason we have small stories about individuals is because we have these crazy platforms like this that allow us to release this information very easily. Whereas before, actually preserving some amount of written information about yourself was this incredible sort of state-based effort of, carving little literal messages into stone, and then actually preserving an intellectual elite, never mind the country's actual political elite, but an intellectual elite that knows the language and will continue to communicate it to future generations. Those are the sort of like basic parameters of history that I find really interesting. With the colonial aspect sort of tied in. That's again a reason to read British history and to try and understand exactly what's going on in this moment.
Are you, in your kind of writing so far, are you focusing on colonialism and elitism? And are you looking at them historically or from a modern context or both?
Thank you. So one of the things I find very interesting about the UK is I think it's a really good place to get an understanding of what our modern conception of the elite actually is. And for those listening at home who said the word elite like 50 times already, the elites are genuinely this sort of general description of this class of people who hold some level of power in the country, which people think of as being important. In the political science literature, it's become a very useful word to sort of catch-all for a group of intellectual, but also political and wealthy. Like this catch-all for this group of people who are clearly doing important things. But these days we can't just like say, oh yes, it's the king and their whole family. That's the cornerstone of power. It's got to be a more diverse, a more inclusive economically, and just in general, the elites are much more expansive class. They're a huge group of people in a way today that they just weren't before. So one of the things that I'm trying to do in my writing and in my reading is try and figure out who they are and what they're doing and what this group is. And one of the ideas that I think is really interesting and that I'm definitely trying to put in the book in any way that I can is this idea of, the elites as a class definitely don't understand where they begin and where normal people begin. Right? So as a class, the elites have no real conception of the border lines between them and the rest of humanity. Or in sort of political terms, they don't have an idea of which of those among them actually wields more political power than the others. Does that kind of make sense? So if we think of this in terms of a vote, realistically in a democratic society, we understand that everybody's vote is not in fact just one vote. There are in fact people among us who quote unquote cast the same vote as us, but because of all sorts of mechanisms that exist in society, their vote is actually worth about 1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 times that of ours. Whether that is because they have vast amounts of money backing them, whether it's because they're very influential, whatever their their route to increasing the power of
Yeah.
themselves in this political situation,
Right.
they have achieved it. The problem is lots of the people who do this don't seem to be aware of where that line is. And obviously, if you were aware, there would be a great advantage to you saying that you weren't aware and very little advantage to you saying you were. Mm-hmm. Right? So these are the sort of basic issues that face us when we're trying to consider and understand an elite. And I think the case of the UK is especially important for understanding this because the UK seems very much to be controlled by an ignorant elite, by
Yeah.
a group of people who are in charge of the country but don't understand that it's them who is pulling
Yeah.
the strings.
Yeah.
And this, to me, is a really interesting and sort of new way of interpreting this elite,
Right.
national relationship that is so important across the world.
Yeah.
But I think might be easier to track down in what was a small and very powerful country.
Yeah.
But still, to this day, only has about 60 million people in it, has been geographically constrained very well.
Right.
So hopefully this group of amorphous people, to which I may or may not belong, I don't even know,
Yeah.
that does very really, the
Yeah.
problem is even if they don't understand it, they do actually control the country.
Right.
And part of this, and part of my exploration with this stuff is trying to explain to people how it is that a set of structures can control things and create a whole bunch of limitations on decision making that
Yeah.
constrain individuals in ways that they don't really understand.
Yeah, exactly.
Making them make the sorts of decisions that by the time they reach normal human beings like you and I,
Yeah.
We are upset.
Yeah.
That is the decision that's being made,
Yeah.
which is totally fair and sensible.
Absolutely. I mean, this is a great point that gets, I think, brought up a lot by journalists and those that actually spend time with the so-called elites.
Yeah.
Is a lot of people, especially in the conspiratorial realm, think that the elites are part of this cabal of, hand-wringing kind
Yeah.
of Mr. Burns-like figures hunched around a table,
deeply
doing
anti-Semitic
occult
imagery,
rituals.
unfortunately.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly, and a lot of that's rooted in anti-Semitism. But well, the journalist who came out with the book, for example, Davos Man, because he spent time, I think his name is Goodman, spent time at Davos, for example, and he said, you get there and you realize people actually believe they're doing good things.
We're trying, yeah.
And even if their policies are terrible, or it ends up just kind of substantiating wealth,
Of course.
they do it because they pat themselves on the back, and they really do kind of affirm as part of that elite discourse that we're actually fixing the world, when they're obviously not, right?
Yeah, there you
But
go.
it's a kind of theology of power that's created in spaces like this. So I think helping people understand how the elite works is incredibly important, and especially in politically turbulent times.
Well, it's the bit that's so human about it
Yeah.
all, right? It's the bit that I think everybody finds it very easy to relate to. The extent to which all of us individually are carried along by particular systems or
Yeah.
carried along by social, political systems
Yeah.
that we have a very strong hand in creating and in maintaining in our own lives.
Yeah.
Never mind the larger, more complicated ones beyond us. But that still make us unhappy in that still, even though we're participating in this political system, we feel like we're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
It's still in many ways it feels like it's acting against us or it's hurting us.
Yeah.
And that's the general sort of dilemma that I think the whole, to go back to your original question about why I'm writing the book, that's the general sort of dilemma that I see each time I return to the UK, and that I feel quite strongly in my family and just in the world as a whole. That I try in some small way to address and sort of give my own perspective on.
No, that's really cool.
Thank you, man.
And I also think the book is coming at a really interesting time because there's been a recent election in the UK.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know if you just came from England a couple weeks ago. You've spent a lot of time there recently in this kind of period of upheaval. I just wanted to know if you wanted to talk about that and if that's been influencing your writing or your thinking about this book at all.
Of course. Yeah, I mean, definitely. So my most recent trip to the UK, always trips to the UK are moments for reflection and thought. Yeah, this This most recent election, so for me, of course, I'd tapped very much out of the cycle. It's been a crazy year.
Yeah.
But also this election for the last 2 years or something has been seen by the political elite,
Yeah.
by people in the know at least. It's been a wash, right?
Right.
We knew it was going to be a wash.
Yeah.
And it's certainly the internal party politics that dictated that both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss got power.
Right.
The people will try and spin that. You can look at the politics of it. You can go back and check it out day by day and how it actually went down. Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss were the only two people who wanted the job, and the reason they were the only two people who wanted the job was because it was political poison.
Right.
What was going to happen would have happened. The Conservatives were incredibly unpopular in the UK.
Right.
They'd been ruling for many years. They'd just ruled over several huge crises in a row. Corona had happened. Brexit had happened. Either one of those things individually, in the UK, I think would have been enough to smash the existing government. But that's just not the way the election cycles ended up working.
Yeah.
And it turned into this silly fest of the Conservatives, throwing basically whoever they could under the bridge. But that is really important to understand for why Liz Truss ruled for 49 days and did a terrible job. It's not because it's because literally nobody wanted the gig.
Right.
Everybody knew that if they took it, their political careers would be over in the next year. As we saw for both Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, who's now on his way out.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's no surprise, of course, that we see members of the Conservative Party who normally would never get a shot at being Prime Minister rising to the top in that moment.
Right.
And there's much to be said about that.
Yeah.
That are very reflective of British society.
Right. Yeah.
That current election has been interesting for me. I mean, one of the things that I think has been really positive was just going to the UK and seeing how excited my grandmother was. This is
so more of a person. There's a personal side to this as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that, for me, Keir Starmer, our new guy, he seems very similar to much of the Labour representation that has occurred within my life, and that I'm not massively excited for.
Yeah.
But he's very different from he's different for sure from the Conservative batch that came before him. I mean, he's very different from the most recent Conservative batch, I think.
You're right.
But the extent to which, people in my family are excited, people just in general in the UK were so ready for a change.
Yeah.
It's been a really rough ride for a really long time.
How long has it been with the Conservatives? Do you remember?
14 years,
14
I think.
years,
Yeah.
wow.
And I think
it's a long time.
Yeah, and I think 13 with Labour before.
Oh, man.
Yeah, it's been a long time, and that's part of it too. When a particular government has been around that long in that sort of system, it flips.
Yeah.
And of course, one of the things I'm trying to talk about more in the book, is when you have these sorts of flips in that sort of system, you create the opportunity for really quite radical shifts in policy over quite short time frames.
Right.
And what this has meant in the UK is that the civil service essentially acts as like shock brakes. It has all sorts of different ways of putting the damper on whatever set of ambitious and exciting policies happen to, the new PM shows up with let's do this. And
so just so people know, right, the civil service is important to talk about just briefly in England because it works differently there.
It's a totally different thing.
Yeah.
No, I was trying to explain this to my cousins in the reverse during my trip. Sorry.
So I realized this. I was watching a British show called In the Thick of It, which is it's with the Scottish guy who became the Doctor on Doctor Who for a little while. So he's yelling in a very loud Scottish way, but essentially you see in the show an election happen, right? And the civil servants get to stay in the same office that their political opponents were, that the one party leaves and then their political opponents arrive in, but the civil servants have their jobs, they're fine, right? But it was so bizarre seeing this woman who's essentially been tasked with running kind of political espionage for one party under the table, then suddenly have to just sort of start batting for the other team overnight after this election.
Close up one set of folders and
Yeah,
open them the other
exactly.
set.
Yeah.
And of course in theory there's all sorts of like insulation, and there's very strict laws that have been passed to try to make sure. But
Right.
it's all one person's brain. Like,
Yeah,
what are you gonna do?
exactly.
It all goes in one person's head.
It's such a wild, that part of the system is so wild to me. It's really interesting.
And of course, there's always a level to which it works the same here. But
Right.
the extent to which the civil service in the UK has a culture, has its own setup and systems and career paths, and all of this stuff that's dedicated to it and manufactured specifically for it to be the way that it is.
Yeah.
It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
It's not, the institution over here really isn't that comparable. But in this particular case, what I was talking about was its ability to sort of respond to new and changing policies in ways that allow it to sort of protract any sort of major change until the civil service can be sort of sure that it's worth their while to try on it. Does that kind of make sense?
Yeah.
Right? Because the problem is the moment you start a big project going, for those of you who have never started any big projects, actually having a big project going is much less about trying to balance like 18 balls in the air at the same time, and much more about being strapped to the front of an 18-wheeler. Like, it's tremendous momentum. You have all this stuff built up, and if you stop working, it's not like it all falls apart at once. It's just that it starts to suck more and more, and these different things start to fall off, and then eventually the inertia runs out. But for really huge projects, boom, that stuff keeps going, and you can't just slam the brakes on it. If you're going around to every hospital and adding beds or whatever, and the next administration comes in and they're like, stop knocking down walls, building new beds or whatever it happens to be, it takes time for all that information to get disseminated out into this network of people who are actually doing things, and then for them to go, hang on a second, I got to do something different. It's funny how it's one of the things that I find fascinating about history and about political science each time I reapproach it, is that each system has all of these different crazy little subsections to it, and it has all of these different perspectives and things. Anyway, sorry, we got a little further off from the main election, buddy. But
no, that's okay. I think we're leading in interesting places, and I think to kind of start to wrap it up, I wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of your writing process and how, is there a timeline on the book? Like,
Thank you, buddy.
When are we going to be able to read it?
So if everything goes perfectly, there will be a book in the world sort of early, mid next year.
Nice.
That's the kind of plan.
That's very exciting.
25. In terms of process, I've gotten so much better at writing long projects over the last couple of years. I think the biggest thing that I have gained recently is actually sort of separating out these draft periods versus these revision periods much more sharply than ever before. And really in my drafting stage, I'm generating large quantities of written material in a couple different forms. But the most important thing is that I can track it all down and it's relatively gatherable into a single space.
Nice, man.
So that means it has to be mostly in the same format, either paper or digital. And you want to be able to have some idea how much you're writing. And that allows you to set your first sort of like quantity goal. And you churn out 60 pages or something. And once you're done your 60 pages, you have this like body of writing that you can essentially remix.
Right? Nice.
It's basically a remixing process. You got this big chunk, like 60 pages, that's half of a small book. That's enough for you to go through and be like, okay, what is the part of this that's working really well? What's the sort of flow in the text that I've created? What are the sort of narrative portions that should be gathered together? And then what you do in the revision stage is you're not focused on generating big new chunks of text. In fact, you're mostly focused on cutting things out and just gathering major themes and ideas together.
Okay.
So that's sort of, from there, really, once you've done that initial, I think the hardest part with writing a large text is getting started.
Yeah.
And once you've generated that big chunk of text that's just draft, but on a topic that you care about. It's not just random text, random essays. It's focused on the UK or whatever you want.
Yeah.
And then you have that big body of text that you can go through and essentially comb.
Right.
You know, and you're just trying to get out the individual pieces that you think are really good, that you like, and then move them closer together.
Yeah.
And that's really all writing is. It's finding the pieces of writing that you wrote good and moving them closer to other pieces that you wrote good and deleting the bits that you wrote bad. And eventually what you have is gooder than it is badder.
There you go.
You've got a decent set.
You got a decent,
The last steps are really from that initial big revision. That gives you your overall sort of structure through the text.
Yeah.
And really, you just then go through and you go and you do sort of the much more natural like edit. Process that you're used to from essay writing, right? Where you go through and you read it and you're like, oh, well, this needs a paragraph on this and yada yada. And from there, on the reread, you get just so much more information and knowledge about what it is that you've done, what it is that you're interested in now. You've done some more reading. All that new information starts to go in. That's also, I don't mess around, in case you're curious. Sorry for just unloading on you. But I also don't mess around. So obviously I do lots of reading. I gather references. Most of my references, this is a bad example because I'm not doing it for this book, but most of my references are actually on little cards, which I leave in the book because I don't like writing books because I'm a weirdo. But are little cards that I leave in the book, and then I don't bother trying to incorporate any of that into the major note until literally the final stage. Until until I've gotten that draft final stage. Until I've gotten that draft all written up, the 60 pages ready to go. Until I've done that big pass through to get that overall structure. Because in my experience, once you start putting in those little pieces of really sharp, detailed information, they sort of like anchor the text. Like for my words, I got no problem going in and like rewriting it, deleting it, messing it around. But the moment I start putting in like references to other people's work, they seem to serve as like anchor points. It's really hard for me to move around them again.
Well, especially because you're going to try to pull the best stuff out, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's not like you can just get rid of the best quotes of this book if it's important to your argument, for example.
Exactly.
Yeah. No, that's a really great kind of clue into your writing process. And I guess just to finish up, I wanted to ask you, what's something really cool that either you are reading or writing right now about England? Something to leave the viewers with, a little taste.
Reading or writing about England. I'll leave you one of my favorite little stories. So there's a couple fun details here I think I'm missing. And there's several stories quite like this from the early times. But basically, some weird monk shows up on a foreign shore. In this case, it was the Emerald Isle, and encounters this mystical world of pagans. And goes around and through some magical power of will or confusion or practice, converts all of these people. Right. And the legend of this, in this particular case, is of course a saint that everybody's heard of, everybody's favorite saint. It's Saint Patrick.
That's right.
And Saint Patrick, of course, is famous for getting super slammed all the time. No, I'm just kidding. He's famous for bringing Christianity to Ireland. And it's a crazy story. Like a monk shows up, and it literally it essentially starts its own sub-branch of Christianity that lives on for about 100 years, independent of the Roman Catholic Church entirely. And we know this because when the Roman Catholic Church reinitiates contact, they're so out of date that they have different calendars for Easter and things. And there's a huge battle between the like more Roman Catholics and the Celtic Christians who are like, no, we want Easter on this day, no, we want Easter. And, sections of Scotland, I think Scotland converts immediately, it doesn't matter, but then everything wanders down south, and like some part of the north of England like holds, I think it's near Innisfil. Innisfarm, something. They hold out for like 50 years or whatever it is, because they don't want to change their thing. You guys, Rome can change, or whatever. But that to me, there's several stories like that, and they're all crazy. Saint Dunstan as well, total lunatic.
Interesting.
Shows up, and he's really responsible for the vast majority of the more modern Roman Catholic compared to that. Like St. Dunstan's, 200-300 years, I believe, after St. Patrick.
Right.
And he basically forcibly converts, the sort of northern and western sections of England.
Wow.
He shows up, either converts them by asking nicely, and then when they don't convert by asking nicely, he's like, "You're infidels," shows up with a bunch of people with swords, kills them all unless they convert.
Yeah.
It's very straightforward stuff. And maybe that's more of what was happening in the St. Patrick style. It's been whitewashed over the years.
Yeah.
But that to me is those stories of like one dude sort of showing up.
Yeah.
And just like, converting a massive group of people, ruling a massive group of people just randomly, or becoming a journeyman or an adventurer. There's so many of these like crazy little individuals who like just manage to reach through the sands of time.
Yeah, and really, really make a difference. Yeah.
Yeah,
it's pretty remarkable.
In some sort of way that people thought was impressive enough that they kept talking about it.
Yeah.
And now of course to us the idea of some dude converting massive swaths of people in some foreign land is terrifying and not really to be
emulated
whatsoever.
Or celebrated.
But clearly it was a serious notice of that at the time.
And I mean, St. Patrick was enslaved in Celtic society.
Was he?
Yeah, as far as I know, and then he escapes, and so I think it's good to mention that Celtic society was not perfect at this time. And there's a lot of kind of different values and different practices within indigenous European societies, just like indigenous societies everywhere, that
of course
we're not great. It's not their fault. It's just happens when you have human societies. There's going to be some terrible things that happen in those societies. But I think the key about this that I loved learning about was that historically there's a case to be made for Celtic Christianity and preserving Celtic Christianity, since it did survive on its own for as you say a century before the Roman Catholics kind of cottoned on to what was going on.
There's an aspect of unique
that's
religious observance there.
Yeah.
And I think that vision of the Catholic Church, of it sort of sending off these little offshoots that somehow blossom into something, and then it suddenly seeing the blossoming and having to reach over there and recorrect. Like, that's a vision of the Catholic Church we just don't think of in this modern age.
It only comes up kind of for me when I look at what's happening in Mexico and South America, because of the rise of, which we can get to later, but the rise of Santa Muerte, and how some people worship essentially Saint Death in their Catholic practices, and then the Pope has to come and be like, don't do that. So anyway, we could get into that maybe another time, but it's nice. These themes, they pop up time and time again sometimes.
For sure. All right, buddy. Well, thanks so much for chatting with me on the UK, and
thank you so much. Catch you on the next one, guys.
Bye for now.
Bye for now.